The weight of a dying god. There is a room beneath the mountains of Terra, deeper than any mine ever dug, older than most of the nations that once carved up the surface above it, and within that room something sits that was once a man. The walls around it have been carved with 10,000 years of devotion. The air is thick with incense and machine oil, and the faint, sweet scent of decay that no amount of ritual purification has ever fully driven out. Custodians stand in silence for decades without moving. Tech priests murmur catechisms to the machine spirits of a device so old and so complex that no living soul fully understands how it works anymore. And at the center of all of this, wired into a throne of gold and iron and arcane technology that stretches back to the dark age of technology, sits the Emperor of Mankind. He has been sitting there for over 10,000 years. The body is a ruin, that much is certain. Whatever the Golden Throne sustains, it is not health. The flesh has long since abandoned any pretense of vitality. Bones show through skin that has pulled tight and darkened. The eyes, when they can be said to open at all, are windows into something that may no longer be entirely human. What keeps the body from simple dissolution is not life in any recognizable sense, but rather a machinery so advanced it borders on miracle and a psychic presence so immense that its pressure can be felt by gifted individuals standing several corridors away. The Emperor of Mankind is not alive. He is also not dead. He is something that exists in the space between those two conditions, and the entire civilization of humanity has been built around the continuation of that liminal state. And the throne is failing. This is not speculation or heresy or the whispered panic of those who have lost their faith. It is documented, confirmed, and deeply, profoundly terrifying. The Adeptus Mechanicus, those servants of the machine god who dedicate their entire existence to the maintenance and understanding of ancient technology, have examined the Golden Throne and reached a conclusion that they dare not say aloud in public, but that has filtered through the highest levels of imperial power, in whispers and sealed documents and meetings held behind triple-locked doors. They do not know how to fix it. They do not fully understand it. They cannot replicate it. Every year, the device degrades a fraction more. Every year, the maintenance costs more effort, requires more sacrifice, and yields diminishing returns. The Mechanicus's arrangement with Dark Eldar Homunculi, a deal of breathtaking desperation in which the Imperium effectively sold billions of human lives for technical assistance, bought perhaps a few more centuries at best. At some point, the throne will stop, and when it does, something will happen that the Imperium of Man has spent 10,000 years structuring its entire civilization around preventing. The man on the throne will die. The light that guides every ship through the void will go dark. The barrier that holds back the tide of the warp in the most sacred place in human space will crumble, and the galaxy will change in ways that no war, no plague, no alien invasion has ever managed to achieve. This is the question that sits at the heart of Warhammer 40,000, not just as a narrative device or a source of grimdark atmosphere, but as a genuine philosophical and cosmological problem that the setting has been wrestling with since its earliest days. What happens when the Emperor dies? What does his death actually mean? For humanity, for chaos, for the alien races that share this galaxy, for the warp itself? And perhaps most intriguingly of all, is death even the right word for what would happen to a being of his nature? That is what we are going to explore today. All of it. The practical catastrophe, the cosmic horror, the strange and fragile theories of rebirth, and the deeper question of what the Emperor actually was and what he might yet become. Because this story does not have a simple ending. It never did. And understanding why requires understanding what the Emperor actually is, what the Golden Throne actually does, and how completely and utterly everything in the Imperium of Man depends on a dying man's stubborn refusal to let go. The Golden Throne, a machine that wasn't meant to last. To understand the consequences of the Emperor's death, you first have to understand what the Golden Throne is actually doing, because it is doing several things simultaneously, and each of those things has its own catastrophic failure mode if it stops. The Golden Throne was not originally built for what it is being used for now. That is the first and perhaps most important thing to grasp. The device predates the Horus Heresy. It was constructed during the Great Crusade, in the early days of the Imperium, when the Emperor was still a living god-king walking among his sons and planning the greatest civilization humanity had ever known. At that time, the throne was an amplifier, a psychic relay. The Emperor's plan was not to sit on it forever and sustain himself through borrowed psyker souls. His plan was to use it as the gateway to something far more ambitious. The Emperor had a project. He was building a private tunnel through the Eldar webway, that impossible network of interdimensional passages woven through the fabric of reality by a species whose understanding of psychic architecture makes humanity look like a child drawing in the dirt. If he could complete it, humanity would gain access to faster-than-light travel that did not pass through the warp. Ships would not have to plunge into the roiling nightmare of the immaterium, exposed to the predations of chaos entities and the constant risk of temporal dislocation and reality erosion. They would sail through the webway instead, safe, swift, and sheltered. It was a plan that would have changed everything. It would have made the Astronomicon unnecessary. It would have separated humanity from the warp entirely, starving the chaos gods of their greatest food source. Then Magnus the Red happened. In his attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal, Magnus used a sorcery so immense that it tore a hole through the psychic wards surrounding the Webway project beneath the Imperial Palace. The barrier that the Emperor had been maintaining collapsed, and through the breach poured the demonic legions of the Chaos Gods, flooding into the tunnel that had been meant as humanity's salvation and turning it into a highway for things that should not exist. The Emperor was forced to abandon the Webway project and take the throne himself, spending his full psychic power simply to hold the breach shut, to keep the demons contained, to maintain the barrier so that Terra itself did not become a staging point for an invasion from within. He has been doing this ever since. So the first thing the throne does is seal a wound, a permanent gash between real space and the warp that sits directly beneath the most sacred city in human civilization, held shut by an act of will that has been ongoing for over 10,000 years, without pause, without rest, and without end. The moment that will stops, the wound opens. What happens next has been described in imperial documents under classifications so severe that most people who have seen them did not survive the reading. The second thing the throne does is power the Astronomicon. This is the aspect that most people in the Imperium are vaguely aware of, at least in the way that people are vaguely aware of the principles behind any technology they use, without really understanding it. The Astronomicon is a psychic beacon, a lighthouse in the warp. It burns with the combined life force of up to 10,000 specially selected psychers, individuals with sufficient psychic sensitivity to contribute their mental energy to the signal, who are slowly consumed in the process. Up to 1,000 of them die every single day. Their lives are poured into the beacon, and the Emperor himself, at the core of this arrangement, amplifies and directs the signal across a distance of roughly 50,000 light-years. Every navigator on every ship crossing the Imperium uses this beacon as their fixed point. In the warp, where direction and distance are concepts that lose their meaning quickly, where a wrong turn can drop you 10,000 years in the future or deposit you in the middle of a daemon's feast, the Astronomicon is the one reliable reference. The star that does not move. Remove it, and navigation becomes not merely difficult, but effectively impossible, beyond the shortest of hops between nearby systems. The Imperium of Man spans 1,000,000 worlds. Those worlds are connected by shipping lanes and military deployments and tithe collections and the movement of goods and soldiers and refugees and pilgrims. All of it flows through the warp. All of it depends on the Astronomicon. Without it, the network does not slow down. It stops. The third thing the throne does is sustain the Emperor himself. The machinery keeps the biological remnant alive, such as it is. It filters and recycles whatever processes still occur in the ruined body. It maintains the connection between the flesh and whatever the Emperor has become in the warp. This is perhaps the most poorly understood function of all, because what exactly the Emperor is in the warp is a question that even the most learned scholars of the Inquisition cannot answer with confidence. Is he a consciousness, a soul, a god? A psychic entity that has already undergone a partial transformation into something that does not need a body at all? The answer depends on which source you consult and which era of the lore you trust, and we will get into that in considerable depth later. But for now, what matters is that the throne is doing something to maintain this connection, and if the throne stops, that connection breaks. The degradation of the throne has been ongoing for a long time. The Mechanicus has known about it and kept it secret, which is itself a stunning indictment of the bureaucratic rot at the heart of imperial governance. The knowledge that the device keeping their god alive is slowly breaking down, that no one knows how to repair it, that every year brings them fractionally closer to an end they cannot prevent, has been classified at the highest possible level and shared only with those who absolutely must know, which means that the vast majority of the Imperium, the soldiers and citizens and priests and administrators who sustain civilization on a million worlds, have been going about their lives in complete ignorance of the countdown ticking away beneath the mountains of Holy Terra. How much time is left? The estimates vary. Some sources suggest centuries, some suggest far less. The Dark Eldar intervention extended the timeline, but the Inquisitor, who investigated the aftermath, concluded that the extension was measured in centuries, at most, not millennia. And given that this same investigation revealed a homunculus conducting grotesque experiments in the tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace, in exchange for this help, even calling that arrangement a success requires a generous definition of the word. The clock is running, the machine is breaking, and eventually, one day, in a chamber beneath the mountains of a world that billions of humans consider the holiest place in existence, the last systems will fail, the psychic wards will drop, and the Emperor of mankind will experience something he has not experienced in over 10,000 years. Whatever comes after that is what we are here to talk about. The first minutes. When the light goes out, imagine you are a navigator. Your family has served on void ships for 30 generations. Your mutated third eye, the warp eye that sits beneath your diadem, has guided vessels safely through the immaterium since you were barely old enough to hold the title. You have crossed the galaxy twice. You have seen things in the warp that would break an ordinary human mind, and you have learned not to flinch at them. You have done this because there is always the Astronomicon. Even in the deepest warp, even in the darkest translation, when everything else in the immaterium shifts and writhes and reaches for you, the Astronomicon is there, a golden light at the center of everything, a fixed point that the madness cannot touch. It burns with the warmth of something ancient and powerful and unassailable. Navigators do not worship the Emperor in the formal sense that the rest of the Imperium does, but they revere that light with something that amounts to the same thing. It is their anchor, their North Star, their proof that there is still order somewhere in the chaos. And then it goes out, not gradually, not with warning. One moment it is there, constant and brilliant and eternal, and then it is not. The warp, which had been merely dangerous, becomes suddenly, completely, terrifyingly dark. A darkness that is not simply an absence of light, but an active presence. Because without the Astronomicon to serve as a fixed point, without the Emperor's psychic presence to act as an island of order in the sea of chaos, the warp rushes in to fill the void. Every navigator on every ship in transit at that moment loses their bearings simultaneously. Ships that were threading carefully calculated paths through the immaterium suddenly find themselves without a reference point. The routes they had memorized, the stellar landmarks they had learned to identify, the safe channels that had been mapped by generations of their predecessors, all of these depended on triangulation from the Astronomicon. Without it, they are not merely lost. They are in the warp, with no way to find their way back. Some ships will make it out, the ones closest to their destination, the ones with sufficiently gifted navigators who can make the leap on instinct alone, the ones that get lucky in the way that the warp occasionally permits. But most will not. Ships caught mid-transit, when the Astronomicon fails, are among the most pitiable things imaginable. They will drift in the immaterium, their shields straining against entities that can now reach for them without the warding presence of the Emperor's psychic power, their crews slowly going mad as time behaves in ways that time is not supposed to behave, until the ships either emerge somewhere they were not trying to go, centuries off course, or they do not emerge at all. The initial death toll, in the first few minutes of the Emperor's death, measured only in ships and their crews, would be staggering. There are always thousands of vessels in transit at any given moment across the Imperium. Military transports, merchant freighters, pilgrim ships, supply convoys, Adeptus Astartes, strike cruisers running to the aid of beleaguered worlds, black ships carrying psychers to Terra for sanctioning, inquisitorial frigates pursuing leads across the galaxy. The moment the Astronomicon goes dark, all of them are stranded in the worst possible environment that exists in the 41st millennium. But the ships are only the first thing. On Terra itself, the consequences begin even faster. The Emperor has been the barrier, holding back the demonic tide, since Magnus's mistake first opened the breach beneath the palace. The moment the throne stops, that barrier drops. And what has been waiting on the other side of that barrier for 10,000 years, pressing against it with an eagerness that does not diminish because the warp does not experience time the way that living things do, surges through. The tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace, those ancient and labyrinthine passages that the Emperor had been carving as his webway project, become something entirely different in the space of a heartbeat. They become entrances, doorways that open not onto the carefully maintained corridors of the palace, but onto the roiling nightmare of the Immaterium, and through those doorways pour things that have been denied access to Terra for 10,000 years. The custodians who patrol those tunnels, those golden giants who are the finest warriors humanity has ever produced, would face an assault so sudden and so overwhelming that even their superhuman capabilities would be tested beyond any previous encounter. The warp storm would not be limited to the tunnels either. A psychic shockwave of the magnitude that the Emperor's death would produce would tear the barrier between the real and the immaterial across the entire segmentum solar. Terra, the Moon, Mars, all of the ancient and holy and vital systems that form the heart of the Imperium would be wrapped in a warp storm of unprecedented scale. The Eye of Terror exists because of the birth of Slanesh. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the great rift that now cuts the galaxy in half, opened with the fall of Cadia and the deaths of billions. The Emperor's death would be a psychic event of comparable or greater magnitude, and it would not be confined to a single region. It would radiate outward from Terra like a shock wave from the largest explosion in human history. The first minutes of the Emperor's death would, in practical terms, be apocalyptic, not metaphorically, not in the loose sense in which the word gets used to describe great disasters. Actually apocalyptic, the end of things that cannot be replaced or rebuilt or recovered, the loss of infrastructure that has sustained human civilization for 10,000 years, the opening of wounds in reality that may never fully close. And none of this yet touches what the Emperor's death means for the warp itself, for the Chaos Gods and their response, for the wider political and military structure of the Imperium, or for the question of what happens to the Emperor's soul. Those are the layers beneath the immediate catastrophe, and they are, in some ways, even more disturbing. If you made it this far, and you are somewhere on this earth watching this, drop a comment below and let us know where you are and what time it is. There is something genuinely wonderful about knowing that people scattered across the world are listening to the same story in the dark. And if you have not already, subscribe. It genuinely helps, and there is a lot more of this kind of thing coming. A galaxy set adrift. The collapse of the Imperium. The Imperium of man is not like modern nations. It does not have instant communication. It does not have infrastructure that can compensate for the loss of its primary travel network. It is a feudal empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds, held together not by anything so reliable as efficient governance, but by the slow circulation of ships through the warp, carrying tithes and orders and reinforcements and information across distances so vast that a message from the Segmentum Obscurus might take years or decades to reach Terra, even under normal conditions. This system is fragile in ways that the Imperium has never fully acknowledged, because acknowledging fragility requires confronting mortality, and the Imperium has spent 10,000 years building an ideology that treats mortality as a condition that applies to individuals, but not to the institution itself. The Emperor is eternal, the Imperium is forever. These are the things that are written in the sacred texts and carved into the walls of every basilica on every world. The collapse of the Astronomicon would not just destroy the physical network, it would destroy the belief system that holds the network together. The first consequence, beyond the immediate loss of ships in transit, is the rapid isolation of individual worlds and systems. Faster-than-light travel is possible without the Astronomicon, technically. Navigators can make short jumps between nearby systems, using astronomical reference points in real space as their guide, essentially feeling their way through the immaterium the way ancient sailors navigated by the stars before instruments were invented. But the range of these jumps is severely limited. The Astronomicon allowed navigators to travel thousands of light years in a single translation. Without it, a jump of even 100 light years becomes an exercise in nerve and luck. A journey across the galaxy, which might currently take months or years of subjective time, would become effectively impossible. Centuries might not be enough. This means that the Imperium fractures not over the course of decades, but within years. Worlds that were already on the edge of contact, those frontier systems and far-flung outposts that depended on infrequent supply runs and even less frequent military support, would be the first to lose contact entirely. Within a decade of the Astronomicon's failure, these worlds would have no way to call for help, no way to receive orders, no way to know what had happened at the center of the Imperium. They would simply be alone. And alone, in the 41st millennium, means exposed. The Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, those hundreds of billions of soldiers who form the primary defensive and offensive arm of the Imperium, depends absolutely on the warp network. A regiment raised on one world and deployed to another might cross dozens of light years in transit. The supply lines that keep these forces equipped and fed and reinforced run through the same channels. Cut those channels, and every Imperial force currently deployed somewhere other than its home world is effectively stranded. They will fight until they run out of ammunition and replacements, and then they will do what stranded soldiers always do, which is adapt to survive in whatever environment they find themselves in. Some will become local warlords. Some will be absorbed into planetary defense forces. Some will simply be overwhelmed by enemies that now have no reinforcements to fear. The Space Marine chapters are in a different position. Each chapter is designed to be self-sufficient in a way that the Imperial Guard is not. A chapter has its own fleet, its own supply chain, its own gene seed program, its own culture and traditions. A chapter stranded in a region cut off from Terra by the loss of the Astronomicon does not immediately cease to function. It continues to fight. It continues to recruit. It continues to be, in every practical sense, an effective military force. But without the Astronomicon to guide them across the galaxy, chapters are limited in where they can go and how quickly they can respond to threats. The model of rapid deployment that makes Space Marines so valuable, the ability to drop a strike cruiser into orbit above a threatened world within days or weeks of a request for aid, breaks down completely when warp travel becomes unreliable enough to make every transit an existential gamble. There is also the question of loyalty. Space Marines swear their oaths to the Emperor, and through the Emperor to the Imperium as a whole. Remove the Emperor, and those oaths do not automatically transfer to some new authority. The Adeptus Terra, the High Lords, the Lord Commander. These institutions derive their legitimacy from the Emperor's name. Without the Emperor, that legitimacy is not simply weakened, it is gone. And in the absence of a legitimate central authority, 300 or more chapters of Space Marines, representing hundreds of thousands of post-human warriors, would each begin making their own decisions about who to follow, what to fight, and what the Imperium even means without the god at its center. Some chapters would almost certainly remain loyal to Guilliman, or to whatever authority claimed the mantle of legitimate imperial governance. Others would retreat to their home systems and become regional powers in their own right. A few, particularly those with already strained relationships with the Inquisition or the High Lords, might use the chaos as cover to pursue agendas they had previously been prevented from following. And a very small number, those whose chapter cultures had already drifted toward darkness, or whose proximity to the chaos gods had already begun to erode their moral foundations, might turn in directions that would have been unthinkable when the Emperor still watched. The Adeptus Mechanicus would be a power unto themselves. Mars has always maintained a degree of independence from the Imperium proper. The Mechanicus controls the production of virtually all advanced technology in human space, and their forge worlds are scattered across the galaxy in positions of strategic importance. Without the Emperor to anchor their dual loyalty to the Omnissiah, the Mechanicus would face an internal identity crisis that could split the organization along existing fault lines between different philosophical factions. The magi of certain forge worlds have always held views that would be considered heretical if applied to biology rather than machines. Without the Emperor as the living omnissiah to serve as a unifying figure, those factions might find their moment. The Inquisition would simultaneously become more powerful and more fractured than at any point in its history. Individual inquisitors, those already formidable agents who operate with wide latitude and terrifying authority, even under normal circumstances, would find themselves answerable to essentially no one. Some would use this freedom to pursue their investigations with a ruthlessness previously constrained by the need to avoid political consequences. Others would attempt to hold the Imperium together through sheer force of will, acting as local authorities in the absence of legitimate governance. And a faction that already exists within the Inquisition, those who have long debated the question of what the Emperor really is and what the death of his physical form would actually mean, would find their internal theological disputes suddenly transformed into the most urgent practical questions of the age. The Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle, are perhaps the most interesting case. Their entire organizational identity, the source of their miraculous abilities, their capacity for the faith that manifests as actual physical phenomenon in the real world, is rooted in the Emperor's divine presence. When living saints appear on battlefields, when the prayers of a dying sister somehow turn aside weapons that should have killed her, when the miracle of the Emperor's protection extends itself to shield a shrine world from destruction against all probability, these are manifestations of something real. The Emperor's presence in the warp, amplified by the faith of trillions of worshippers, becomes an actual force. What happens to that force when the source of it dies? Does the faith itself sustain the phenomenon? Does the god have to be alive for miracles to occur? These questions would tear the ecclesiarchy apart even as the galaxy burned around them. The tithe system would collapse within years. Planets tithe to the Imperium, providing soldiers and resources and manufactured goods in exchange for protection and connectivity. But the tithe system works on timescales that were already absurd even before the Astronomicon failed. A tithe demand might take years to arrive. The goods might take more years to collect and ship. The entire arrangement depends on a kind of geological time perspective in which individual delays are absorbed by the sheer scale of the operation. Remove the Astronomicon, and the delays become not geological but permanent. Tithes stop arriving. Protection stops being provided. The mutual obligations that hold worlds within the Imperium's structure dissolve not through any act of rebellion, but simply through the inability to fulfill them. Within a generation of the Emperor's death, the Imperium of Man as a coherent political entity would not exist. What would exist in its place is something far older and perhaps more honest. A collection of human civilizations, some large and some small, some stable and some collapsing, sharing a common heritage and a common enemy, but no longer sharing a common government. The successor states of history will have replaced the world-spanning empire, as surely as any other empire in human memory has eventually fractured, and the darkness that presses in from every direction will have a much easier time of it. The warp unleashed. Demonic floodgates open. The Emperor does not merely sit on his throne and think very hard about navigation. His presence in the warp, even in its degraded and fragmented state, is an active force. He fights. Every moment of every day, for 10,000 years, some portion of whatever consciousness remains in the broken body has been engaged in a constant, invisible, exhausting battle against the entities of the warp. He is the anathema. The chaos gods themselves recognize him as such. His existence is an offense to them, a point of order in the sea of unreason, a light that the darkness cannot consume. When that light goes out, the darkness does not simply fill the space where it was. It surges. The warp is not a passive environment. It responds to psychic events the way the physical universe responds to gravity. It flows toward places of psychic concentration. The death of the most powerful human psyker who ever lived, a being who has spent 10,000 years gathering the faith and worship and hope of trillions of human souls, would produce a psychic event so massive that describing it in ordinary language feels almost inadequate. Think of it as the psychic equivalent of a supernova, an explosion of released energy that radiates outward in every direction simultaneously, warping the fabric of the immaterium, agitating the chaos gods and their demonic servants into a frenzy, tearing new rifts in the already strained boundary between real space and the warp. The Eye of Terror has existed for 10,000 years as a wound in reality, a place where the warp bleeds through into the physical universe. The Cicatrix Maledictum now scars half the galaxy, but both of these are structured, if that word can be applied to anything in the warp, in the sense that they have defined edges and exist in specific locations. The warp storm that would accompany the Emperor's death would not respect those limitations. It would not stay in one place. It would propagate outward from Terra like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, except that these ripples would be walls of psychic fire that could swallow star systems. Khorne would feast. The blood god, whose domain is violence and slaughter and the shedding of blood, would sense the death of his greatest enemy and the chaos that would follow, the wars that would break out across the fragmenting Imperium, the desperate last stands, and the savage opportunistic assaults, and the sheer volume of life ending violently, and respond with an outpouring of demonic forces so vast it would dwarf any previous incursion. Bloodthirsters, those immense daemon generals of the blood god, would manifest across 100 worlds simultaneously. Endless tides of bloodletters would pour through every warp rift, great and small, drawn by the psychic stench of mass death, like sharks to blood in the water. Nurgle, the Plague Father, would see the death of the Emperor as a deeply personal victory and an opportunity not to be wasted. Nurgle loves entropy and decay, and the slow, inevitable degradation of all living things into compost for new growth. The Emperor on the throne has been a symbol of something antithetical to Nurgle's philosophy, a refusal to accept death, a stubborn insistence on continuation against all natural inclination. With the Emperor gone, Nurgle's plagues would reach worlds that had previously been shielded by the psychic warding effect of the Astronomicon and the Emperor's presence. The Death Guard and their demon allies would surge out of their strongholds with renewed vigor. Mortarion, wherever he lurked, would receive this news as the greatest gift his patron had ever given him. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, would have known this was coming. Whether through genuine precognitive ability, or through the manipulation of events across millennia, or through some combination of both, Tzeentch's machinations would have been oriented toward this moment long before it arrived. Tzeentch does not simply want the Emperor to die. Tzeentch wants the death to mean something specific, to trigger chains of causation that lead to outcomes Tzeentch finds interesting. A galaxy of human civilization suddenly thrown into chaos, where plans collapse and new possibilities emerge, and the fundamental assumptions of 10,000 years of rigid order suddenly become negotiable, is exactly the kind of environment Tzeentch most enjoys. Countless cults of Tzeentch, seeded through the Imperium over centuries by agents the Inquisition never fully identified, would emerge and begin pursuing agendas that only now become possible. Slaanesh would respond to the psychic death scream of the most powerful human psyker ever born, with something approaching ecstasy. The Prince of Pleasure feeds on sensation in its most extreme forms, and the death of the Emperor would be the most extreme sensation that human consciousness has ever produced. Additionally, the billions or trillions of human souls that would be lost in the collapse of the Imperium, the spiritual mass of that much suffering and despair and final terror, would pour into the Immaterium as a feast for Slaanesh on a scale not seen since the birth of the god itself claimed the Eldar civilization. But what these four Chaos Gods actually do with the opportunity the Emperor's death creates depends on something they have always struggled with: cooperation. The four powers of chaos are not allies. They are rivals of the most fundamental kind, competing for the same resource, the psychic energy of mortal souls, and they would not simply combine their forces and conquer humanity together. What is more likely is a massive initial surge of demonic activity everywhere, chaotic and overwhelming and impossible for any normal defense to contain, followed by a period in which the Chaos God's mutual antipathy reasserts itself and the incursions become less coordinated. This is, perversely, the galaxy's best chance of surviving the initial catastrophe, not because the Chaos Gods are weak, but because they would be too busy competing with each other to fully capitalize on humanity's defenselessness. On Terra specifically, the situation would be categorically different. The warp breach beneath the Imperial Palace, held shut by the Emperor's will for 10,000 years, would not simply open. It would explode open with the force of everything that had been pressed against it for 100 centuries. The daemons that poured through would not be an invading army in the conventional sense. They would be a tide, an inundation. The custodians defending the palace would be fighting a reality that was actively hostile to their existence, in tunnels that were rapidly ceasing to be tunnels in any physical sense and becoming extensions of the warp. The Talisman of Seven Hammers was built precisely for this scenario, and that is the next thing we need to talk about. The Talisman of Seven Hammers and Terra's fate. Vulcan made something during the heresy, a weapon, but not a weapon meant for use against an army, a contingency. A final measure so extreme that it represents a deliberate choice to deny rather than defend. The Talisman of Seven Hammers was built at the Emperor's direction and installed into the Golden Throne as what military planners in earlier eras would have called a dead man's switch. If the throne fails, the talisman activates, and when it activates, everything within range burns. Not metaphorically, not with the kind of fire that destroys structures and kills people and can eventually be put out. The Talisman of Seven Hammers would produce a conflagration that consumes Terra entirely, the entire planet, the most sacred soil in human civilization, the birthplace of humanity's greatest achievements, and the cradle of every institution that defines what it means to be human in the 41st millennium, would be incinerated so completely that not even the demonic tide that had been pouring through the breach could survive it. The talisman has the specific property of granting daemons a true death, which in the context of how daemons work is a genuinely remarkable and terrifying capability. Daemons do not normally die. They are destroyed in real space and return to the warp, where they reform eventually and emerge again. A true death, the obliteration of the demonic essence, rather than merely its physical manifestation, is something the Chaos Gods find genuinely threatening. So the talisman would burn Terra and everything on it, including the daemons, and in doing so would deny the Chaos Gods the thing they most wanted from the Emperor's death, the corruption of the throne world. Terra transformed into a daemon world, the sacred ground of humanity twisted into a staging post for the ruinous powers, would be an act of cosmic propaganda so powerful that the psychological damage to the Imperium might actually exceed the physical damage. The talisman prevents this. It says, in the language of absolute destruction, you cannot have this. You cannot claim this. Even in defeat, this ground is denied to you. The loss of Terra would be devastating in ways that go beyond the merely practical. Yes, the administrative machinery of the Imperium is centered on Terra. Yes, the Adeptus Custodes and the Sisters of Silence and the Grey Knights and all the other forces tasked with protecting the throne world would be destroyed along with it. Yes, the psychic infrastructure, the Chamber of the Astronomicon, the Webway project that was once the Emperor's greatest ambition, the gene laboratories and archives and sacred sites that connect the present to the very beginning of the Emperor's story, all of it would be gone. These are practical catastrophes of the highest order. But the symbolic loss might be worse. Terra is what the Imperium worships, not the Emperor in the abstract, but the Emperor on Terra, the place itself. The idea of a sacred center, a holy ground toward which all prayers are directed and from which all authority flows. Remove Terra, and the Imperium becomes a religion without its church. Not merely a church that has been damaged or defiled, but one that has been vaporized. The High Lords of Terra would have no Terra to be lords of. The ecclesiarchy would have no holy city to point to. The entire cosmological framework through which the Imperium understands itself would need to be rebuilt from nothing. There is also the question of what the talisman's activation means for the wider segmentum solar. Mars, the red planet, home of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the most important single forge world in the Imperium, orbits the same sun as Terra. The shockwave of Terra's destruction, psychic as much as physical, would reach Mars within minutes. The Martian Mechanicus would survive, probably. Their infrastructure is deep embedded, radiation-hardened, and maintained by a culture that has a 1,000-year history of contingency planning. But the event would be visible to every sensor array in the solar system, and its psychic echo would be felt by every psyker within the segmentum. The message it sends is unmistakable. Terra is gone. The Emperor is dead. There is nothing left to defend. Except, perhaps, this is not entirely true. There is a theory, older than the current edition of the lore, and woven through the setting's mythology from its earliest days, that the Emperor's death is not the end of his story, that the Golden Throne is not merely a prison or a life support system, but something more complicated, that what waits on the other side of the Emperor's physical death might be something stranger and more powerful and more dangerous than anything that has come before. But first, let us look at how the galaxy's other inhabitants respond to the moment that the Imperium falls. The ripple effect. Every faction reacts. The galaxy in Warhammer 40,000 is not defined solely by humanity. The Imperium is the largest human institution ever built, but it shares the galaxy with species and powers that have their own responses to the removal of its central pillar. Some of these responses are predictable, others are more surprising. The traitor legions of chaos. Those space marine forces that turned against the Emperor during the Horus Heresy and have spent 10,000 years in the Eye of Terror, festering and plotting and launching black crusades against an Imperium that never quite fell, would emerge in numbers and with a unity of purpose that they have never previously managed. Their entire existence has been defined by opposition to the Imperium. With the Imperium now collapsing, they would emerge not to fight an enemy, but to claim territory, to establish strongholds, to spread the influence of their patron gods across the smoking ruins of what had been the most powerful human civilization in history. Abaddon the Despoiler, the War Master of Chaos, has launched 13 Black Crusades against the Imperium. The 14th and most successful, the Fall of Cadia, finally broke the physical fortress world that had held the Eye of Terror's exit for 10,000 years and opened the Great Rift. Whether Abaddon is still the dominant voice among the traitor forces after the Emperor's death is uncertain. His power derived from being the most organized and strategically capable of the Chaos warlords, but he derived his legitimate authority from his role as the successor to Horus. With the Imperium gone, the framework that defined his war is gone too, and other Chaos champions might dispute his supremacy. Infighting among the traitors, always a feature of Chaos warfare, might actually intensify at the moment of their greatest victory. The Space Marine chapters loyal to the Imperium would face a crisis unlike anything their traditions had prepared them for. Their oaths are to the Emperor. But the Emperor is dead. What do their oaths mean now? This question would split chapters in ways that gene seed defects and battlefield disasters never had. Some chapters, particularly those with strong independent cultures and defined homeworlds they already consider their primary responsibility, would simply become regional powers. The Space Wolves would defend Fenris and the surrounding systems. The Salamanders would protect Nocturne and the Nocturnian people. The Raven Guard would fight on, because fighting is what they do, and it matters less to them who exactly they are fighting for than that there are people who need protecting. The Iron Hands, those cold and mechanical sons of Ferrus Manus, might attach themselves to a surviving Mechanicus authority. The Ultramarines, under Guilliman if he still lived, would attempt to hold the realm of Ultramar as a bastion of what the Imperium had been. And then there are the chapters whose response is harder to predict, those that already had strained relationships with the Inquisition, those that had been watching the Imperium slide toward religious tyranny and bureaucratic dysfunction with increasing frustration, those whose gene seed instabilities had made them perpetual targets of suspicion. The death of the Emperor removes the shared loyalty that kept these chapters within the fold, and some of them would find that without that constraint, their agendas diverge from anything recognizable as imperial. The Eldar, or Aeldari, response would be complex and divided, because the Eldar are always complex and divided. From the Craftworld Eldar's perspective, the Emperor's death has been foreseen, probably for a very long time. Farseer councils would already have contingency plans. What those plans involve depends on which Craftworld you ask. Some Craftworld Eldar would argue that the Emperor's death, while catastrophic for humanity, is ultimately irrelevant to them, and they should use the chaos to consolidate Eldari resources and retreat further from the galactic conflicts they can no longer meaningfully influence. Others would argue that the vacuum created by the Imperium's collapse presents an opportunity for the Eldari to reclaim worlds that were once theirs, to re-establish a presence in the galaxy that has been diminishing for 30,000 years. The Harlequins, those servants of Segurach, the laughing god, would be making moves that no one outside of their own organization fully understands. The dark city of Camorra, home of the Drukhari, is in its own crisis, following the Great Rift. The Dark Eldar would see the Imperium's collapse as both a threat and an opportunity. Threat because many of the stable warp routes they rely on for their raids would become even more unstable. Opportunity because a million worlds suddenly, without effective defense, is a raider's paradise. The Ynnari, those followers of the newborn Eldar god Yniad, would interpret the Emperor's death through the lens of their theology, which holds that the death and sacrifice of souls feeds their deity's power. The Emperor's death, the largest single psychic event in the galaxy since Slaaneish's birth, would be of immense interest to Yvrain and the Vizurk and the Winkarn. Whether they would try to intervene in the events around Terra, or whether they would use the opportunity to pursue Yniad's agenda, is an open question. The Necrons, those ancient and terrifying metallic skeletal beings who once ruled the galaxy as the Necron tier, before transforming themselves into deathless machines, have their own complicated relationship with the Emperor's existence. The Necrons are generally opposed to chaos, not because they care about order in any philosophical sense, but because the warp and its creatures are a direct threat to the silent, cold, perfectly ordered universe they prefer. The Emperor's death, which would massively empower the Chaos Gods and tear reality across the galaxy, would not be welcome news to most Necron lords. The Silent King, Sarek, who has been working with Guilliman and the Imperium in the current era, precisely because he recognizes the Tyranid and Chaos threats as existential, would face a strategic dilemma. The ally he needed no longer exists. The threats he was fighting alongside that ally are now worse. Does he continue to fight? Does he retreat into isolation and allow events to play out? Or does he see an opportunity to assert Necron dominance over whatever emerges from the ashes? The Tyranids are perhaps the most purely mechanistic in their response. The Hive Mind does not worship or grieve or strategize in the political sense. It consumes. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that navigators used for travel, was also incidentally the signal that originally drew the Tyranid hive fleets across the void between galaxies in the first place. Its extinction removes the directional beacon that some theories suggest the hive fleets have been using to orient themselves toward the galaxy. But the Tyranids are already here. The hive fleets that have been battering at the edges of the Imperium for centuries will not turn around and leave just because the light went out. If anything, the collapse of the Imperium's defensive infrastructure removes the greatest impediment to their advance. Without coordinated military response, without supply lines and reinforcements, and the complex web of mutual defense that makes the Imperium greater than the sum of its parts, individual worlds fall to the Tyranids with terrifying ease. The Tau represent the most interesting xenopolitical case of all. The Tau Empire is young by galactic standards and small by Imperium standards, but it is coherent and growing and possessed of a philosophy in the greater good that, unlike chaos or Tyranid consumption or Necron cold dominion, actually makes room for other species. The collapse of the Imperium on the Tau's galactic doorstep would be simultaneously terrifying and transformative. The crusades that had been pressing toward Tau space would stop. The human worlds on the borders of Tau territory, some of which had already been quietly accepting Tau influence, would suddenly be without Imperial oversight. The Tau expansion, which had always been constrained by the Imperium's presence, would suddenly find vast territories available that it could incorporate or simply protect, not out of generosity, but out of the recognition that a stable buffer of inhabited worlds serves the greater good better than a wasteland of collapsed systems. The Orcs are the simplest case and the most brutally honest about what the Emperor's death means for the galaxy's future. The Orcs exist to fight. They are energized by conflict and confused by its absence. The collapse of the greatest organized military force in the galaxy would not make the Orcs content. It would make them search for the next great enemy, the next great war, with even greater enthusiasm. Orc expansion, always aggressive and difficult to predict, would accelerate dramatically as the military forces that had previously kept them contained collapse or retreat to defend their home systems. Great war bosses and warlords who had been grinding against Imperial defenses for generations would suddenly find those defenses vanishing and the instinct of every orc in the galaxy, from the smallest grot to the largest and most brutal war boss, would be to advance into the opening. In the end, the galaxy that exists after the Emperor's death is not a galaxy in which any single faction wins. It is a galaxy in which everything becomes simultaneously more local and more extreme. Every war that had previously been constrained by the structures of galactic civilization becomes a war that can only be resolved by whoever is physically present to fight it. And in that environment, the creatures and forces that thrive on chaos, on fragmentation, on the collapse of coordination and cooperation, have a massive advantage over those that depend on organization and supply and the network of relationships that civilization provides. Theories of rebirth, the Star Child, and what comes after. The Emperor is dead. The throne has stopped. The Astronomicon is dark. Terra has burned, or will burn. The Imperium is fragmenting. The warp is surging. The Chaos Gods are feasting. And yet, there is a theory, older than any current edition of the lore, woven into the earliest editions of Warhammer 40,000, with a directness that later versions of the setting have muddied but never fully abandoned, that none of this is the end of the Emperor's story, that the physical death of the body on the throne is not the death of what the Emperor actually is, that what happens next involves not an ending, but a transformation so profound and so strange that the categories we use to understand life and death and divinity would need to be discarded entirely. The theory is called the Star Child. To understand it, you need to understand where the Emperor came from. Long before the Horus Heresy, long before the Great Crusade, long before he walked out of the mountains and began the Unification Wars, the Emperor was not one person, he was many. The shaman kings of early humanity, those ancient psychic leaders of prehistoric human tribes who accumulated spiritual wisdom over thousands of years, recognized that the warp was changing, that humanity's growing psychic presence in the immaterium was becoming dangerous, that the Chaos Gods, those vast entities formed from the collective emotions of sentient beings, were turning their attention toward the increasingly powerful human species. To protect their people, these shamans did something extraordinary. They died together, deliberately, and wove their souls into a single entity in the warp, a new being, one that would carry all their accumulated wisdom and power into the physical world as a single, exceptional individual. That individual was the Emperor. He was, from the beginning, a being whose nature spanned the boundary between the physical and the immaterial. He was born as a mortal in the ancient world, in a time before recorded history, and he lived as mortals live, but he did not die as mortals die. He reincarnated repeatedly, carrying the accumulated memories and power of his previous lives forward. He grew stronger with each cycle. By the time he revealed himself to humanity in the 31st millennium, he was something that it stood, with one foot in reality and one foot in the warp, a being whose physical form was less important than the psychic architecture beneath it. The Star Child theory holds that when the Emperor's physical form dies, this is not the end of what he actually is. It is, instead, the release of a consciousness that has been partially imprisoned by the need to maintain the physical connection. His soul, already partly present in the warp, in the form that generations of worshippers have been feeding with their faith, would be freed from the constraints of the broken body, free to do what the souls of the shaman ancestors who created him once did, fully become what they always were, an entity of the immaterium. The question is, what kind of entity? The four Chaos Gods are warp entities born from the collective emotions of mortal beings. Fear and despair feed Nurgle, rage and violence feed Khorne, desire and excess feed Slanesh, hope and scheming and change feed Tzeentch. If trillions of humans worshipping the Emperor for 10,000 years have poured their faith into the warp, what kind of entity has that faith been building? Not a Chaos God. The Emperor's nature is antithetical to chaos, but something shaped by devotion and sacrifice, and the desperate hope of a civilization that needed a god and decided it had one. Something that would be a genuine warp entity, with all the power that implies, but oriented against chaos rather than toward it. Some versions of this theory go further. They suggest that the Emperor anticipated this outcome, that the entire shape of the Imperium, including the cult Mechanicus's practice of worshipping technology as sacred, including the imperial cult's deification of the Emperor, despite his famous dislike for being treated as a god, including the daily sacrifice of psychers that powers the Astronomicon and simultaneously pours psychic energy into the immaterium in a pattern that is perhaps not entirely accidental, has been a 10,000-year preparation for this moment. The Emperor, the theory holds, has not been dying on the throne. He has been cooking. Building the warp presence, he will need to emerge as something capable of facing the Chaos Gods directly. The practical problem with this theory is that the cooking period, if we accept the metaphor, requires the throne to keep working until the transformation is complete. If the throne fails too soon, before the Star Child has accumulated sufficient power to exist independently in the warp, then the consciousness that emerges when the body dies is not a god capable of challenging the chaos powers. It is a soul, vast and powerful, but essentially helpless against entities that have existed since the beginning of sentient life in the galaxy, that would be immediately surrounded and consumed by the very things it was supposed to oppose. The Chaos Gods waiting outside the Emperor's psychic defenses for 10,000 years, pressing against his wards with tireless patience, are not going to step aside politely when his soul finally emerges. There is also the Sensei to consider. In the oldest versions of the Star Child lore, which have been partly reclaimed by recent Black Library publications, even as they were officially decanonized for a period, the Emperor had children, mortal children, born to human women, across his long millennia of incarnations, who inherited a fragment of his psychic nature. His daughters were powerful psychers, but mortal. His sons, the Sensei as they were called, were something different. Psychic blanks, individuals invisible to the warp, effectively immortal, and hunted by both the Inquisition and the Chaos Forces, who recognized them as significant without fully understanding why. The Illuminati, a secret society of individuals who had survived demonic possession and gained immunity to chaos corruption, spent centuries gathering these sensei, protecting them, preparing them for a purpose they were not always told. That purpose was sacrifice. When the Emperor finally died, the Illuminati planned to offer the sensei to him at the moment of his death, in the same way that psychers are daily sacrificed to sustain the throne, but with the concentrated psychic purity of individuals who shared his blood and carried fragments of his nature. This offering, the theory held, would give the emerging Star Child the fuel it needed to fully coalesce in the warp as a genuine entity rather than simply dissipating. The reintroduction of elements of this lore in recent publications, particularly through references in the Siege of Terra series and hints embedded in the narrative around the psychic awakening, suggests that this is not simply forgotten old material, but something that the current Warhammer creators are deliberately weaving back into the living story. The Star Child, as a concept, is being rehabilitated, and this matters because it means that the Emperor's death, far from being purely catastrophic, might be the necessary precondition for something genuinely different. Not a better Imperium, not a healed Emperor back on the throne, but something that has never existed before. A warp god of order, born from 10,000 years of human faith, opposed to the chaos powers at their own level of existence. The Eldar god Yinid, born from the sacrifice of Eldar souls accumulated over millennia, offers an instructive parallel. The Eldar knew for a long time that every Eldar soul consumed by Slaanesh upon death was simultaneously contributing to the slow accumulation of a new entity in the warp, one that would eventually be powerful enough to challenge Slaanesh directly. The birth of Yiniad required the sacrifice of Eldrad Ulthrin's intended offering, plus the faith of an entire craft world. It happened ahead of schedule and imperfectly, resulting in a god that is powerful but not fully realized. The Emperor's equivalent process has been running for 10,000 years, with trillions of worshippers as fuel, which suggests that if the Star Child emerges, it would emerge with considerably more backing than Yin had received. The perpetual question: could he come back? There is another layer to this question that requires a different framework entirely. Not the Star Child theory, not the religious transformation of the Emperor into a warp deity, but something rooted in what the Emperor actually is at the biological level: a perpetual. Perpetuals are individuals, encountered throughout the Horus Heresy novels and established firmly in the current canon, who cannot permanently die. Not immortals in the sense of beings who simply do not age, but something stranger. Individuals whose souls are anchored in the physical world by some mechanism that the setting does not fully explain, such that even when their bodies are destroyed, they reform eventually. They remember their previous deaths. They carry the psychological weight of having experienced death, sometimes many times, but they come back. The Emperor was a perpetual before the Horus heresy. This is explicitly established. He died and was reborn countless times across ancient history. The chain of incarnations that began with the first emergence of his consciousness from the collected sacrificed shaman souls extended forward through thousands of years of mortal lives, each one ending and leading to another. He did not remember all of them clearly, but the pattern of his existence included death as a regular feature that did not hold him permanently. This means that the question of whether the Emperor can come back has an answer that exists at the physical level, separate from any theological consideration. If his perpetual nature is still intact, if the mechanism that causes perpetuals to reform their physical bodies is still functioning despite the state of the current body, then the Emperor's death might not be permanent in the conventional sense. He might, given time, reassemble himself into a new physical form. The question is how long this would take, whether the Chaos Gods could destroy his soul in the immaterium before the Reformation is complete, and what exactly would emerge from the process, given that the body on the throne is so damaged that there might not be much left to anchor a Reformation. Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, was himself a perpetual, and his deaths and returns are well documented within the lore. He was killed multiple times during the Horus heresy, and returned each time, sometimes after considerable delay. His eventual voluntary choice to simply live as a normal mortal Primarch, vulnerable to permanent death, came after his experiences had fundamentally changed him. Whether the Emperor's reformative ability still works after 10,000 years of slow decay in the throne is genuinely uncertain. The throne may be sustaining a process that keeps him in a state below the threshold of death that would trigger the perpetual reformation. If the throne fails, and the body genuinely dies in a complete sense, the perpetual mechanism might activate. Or, the accumulated damage to both body and soul might be too extensive for even that extraordinary mechanism to overcome. There is a third possibility that some inquisitorial scholars have explored in the sealed texts of the most restricted vaults, that the Golden Throne is not sustaining the Emperor at all, that the Emperor's physical body has been dead in any meaningful sense for a very long time, and what the throne is actually doing is maintaining a psychic shell, a construct of the Emperor's former self that inhabits the body the way a ghost inhabits a house, and that the real Emperor, the consciousness and soul and accumulated selfhood of the being who built the Imperium, is already fully in the warp, already the Star Child or something like it, already becoming something new. And the throne is the last connection between that emerging warp entity and the physical anchor that keeps it from either fully manifesting in the warp or fully dissolving into it. If this is true, then the question is not whether the Emperor can come back, but whether the entity that comes back would be recognizable as the Emperor, or would simply be something new that carries his memories and his nature, but has become genuinely different from what he was. Robert Guilliman, when he was brought to the throne in the aftermath of the gathering storm, and granted an audience with whatever remains of his father, emerged deeply disturbed. Not frightened in the way of a man who has seen something terrible, but disturbed in the way of a man who has encountered something that does not fit any existing category. He thought he was going to meet his father. He found something that may have moved well beyond fatherhood into something far stranger. What Guilliman saw or experienced or had pressed into his mind in that audience, he has never fully described. He emerged from the throne room silent and pale, and thereafter spoke of the Emperor in terms that were noticeably less reverential and more pragmatic than they had been before, as if what he encountered was not a father or a god or even a man, but something that had retained the shape of all those things, without necessarily retaining their content. Something that was using the roles of father and god and emperor as tools, rather than experiencing them as identities. This is perhaps the most unsettling version of the Emperor's potential return. Not a triumphant resurrection where the master of mankind walks out of the throne room, hale and terrible, and leads humanity to glorious victory, but a rebirth into something that is neither human nor chaos, that has the Emperor's knowledge and the Emperor's power and the Emperor's understanding of the galaxy's threats. But that relates to humanity the way a human might relate to individual cells in their body, with a kind of utilitarian care that does not quite resemble love, what the Emperor himself might have planned. The Emperor keeps secrets. This is established so thoroughly in the lore that it has become a defining characteristic of his portrayal. He kept secrets from his Primarchs. He kept secrets from Malkador, his closest advisor and perhaps only true friend. He kept secrets from the custodians who guarded his body, and the tech priests who maintained his throne, and the inquisitors who served his will. If there is a plan, and the accumulated weight of the lore strongly suggests there is a plan, then its full scope has never been revealed to anyone. Which means that any discussion of what the Emperor intended must be at least partly speculative, informed by the hints and implications and carefully placed breadcrumbs that the setting has left across decades of lore development. What we can say with confidence is this: the Emperor's original plan was not the Imperium as it exists. The Imperium of man, with its religious fanaticism and its galaxy-spanning inquisition, and its 10,000 years of technological stagnation, and its daily sacrifice of thousands of human lives to sustain a dying man on a failing machine, would have horrified the Emperor who launched the Great Crusade. He wanted a secular, rational, scientifically advancing civilization that would dominate the galaxy not through religious devotion, but through actual human capability. He forbade the worship of chaos gods and explicitly did not want to be worshipped himself. He believed, or at least acted as though he believed, that humanity's greatest strength was its potential, its capacity to grow and learn and build and improve. The Webway project was part of this. Freeing humanity from warp travel would have been the greatest practical gift the Emperor could have given his people. It would have removed the existential vulnerability that comes from depending on an environment actively hostile to human survival for every act of communication and trade and military deployment. It would have severed the connection between humanity's civilization and the Chaos God's feeding ground, and it would have done this not through violence against the Chaos powers, which the Emperor understood could not be permanently won, but through structural change that made human civilization less accessible to them. The imperial truth, the philosophy of rational empiricism that the Emperor attempted to spread during the Great Crusade, was another element of this plan. If humanity genuinely stopped believing in gods and spirits and supernatural forces, if the emotional raw material that feeds the chaos gods was starved through deliberate philosophical practice, the powers of the warp would weaken over time. Not immediately, not easily, but over generations and centuries. A humanity that did not pray to Khorne in its rage, or to Slaanesh in its excess, or to Nurgle in its despair, would gradually deprive those entities of the sustenance that kept them powerful. The Emperor understood that the Chaos Gods are not independent entities. They are reflections, made from the emotional output of mortal consciousness. Stop making the output, and the reflection dims. Lorgar ruined this plan. When the Wordbearer Primarch was humiliated at Monarchia, his city of devoted worship, destroyed by the Emperor's forces as a demonstration that such devotion was unwanted, Lorgar did not abandon his faith. He redirected it. And in redirecting it toward the actual Chaos Gods, he gave those powers the tool they needed to corrupt Horus and start the heresy. The Emperor's secular project did not survive the heresy. What emerged from the rubble was the imperial cult, the very thing the Emperor had tried to prevent, now so deeply embedded in human civilization that removing it would require tearing out the foundations of every institution the Imperium had built. So what did the Emperor do with this? Did he simply accept the irony that his people would worship him despite his wishes? Or did he decide that if he could not prevent the worship, he could at least direct it toward useful purposes? Some theories argue that the Emperor, recognizing after the heresy that the psychic energy of human faith was going to be generated regardless of what he wanted, began using it. That the imperial cult's daily prayers and devotions and hymns are not simply comfort for the faithful, but are, in aggregate, feeding the warp entity that the Emperor has been slowly becoming for 10,000 years. That the worship he never wanted became the mechanism of the transformation he actually needed. There are also theories about humanity's psychic evolution. The Emperor understood, because he was himself the product of a previous stage of human psychic development, that humanity is changing. Psykers are appearing in ever-increasing numbers across the species. The proportion of humans with some degree of psychic sensitivity is growing with each generation. This is, from one perspective, a catastrophe. More psykers means more ways for the warp to interact with human civilization, more risks of demonic possession and psychic accidents, and the kind of uncontrolled manifestations that can wipe out a city. But from another perspective, it is an evolution. Humanity is becoming something more than it was. The question is whether that evolution can be guided toward a form that does not simply make humanity more vulnerable to chaos. If the Emperor's plan includes not just his own transformation, but humanity's collective transformation, then his death might be designed as the catalyst for that process. The release of his psychic influence, which has for 10,000 years been oriented primarily towards sustaining the throne and the Astronomicon and fighting the demonic breach, might be reoriented at the moment of death towards something different. A burst of psychic energy that accelerates human evolution in a specific direction. A gift from the dying god to his people. Not the miracle of continued life, but the gift of becoming something new. Something better equipped to survive in a galaxy that is, honestly, too hostile for humanity as it currently exists. This is deeply speculative, as all theories about the Emperor's intentions must be. He has never told anyone his full plan. He has given hints to Guillemot and dropped implications in conversations that lasted seconds but contained decades of meaning. He has shaped events through actions that only make sense in retrospect if you assume they were deliberate. But the actual plan, the document that would allow us to say, yes, this is what he intended, has never existed in a form that anyone outside his own consciousness has seen. What is not speculative is that the Emperor is not a passive figure. Everything in the lore suggests an active consciousness, limited by the constraints of the throne and by the impossibility of direct communication, but engaged and purposeful and oriented toward outcomes that he considers worth the cost. The question of what those outcomes are is perhaps the most interesting open question in the entire setting. The end of everything, or a new beginning? We have come a long way from the room beneath the mountains, from the body that is not quite a body, and the throne that is not quite a life support system, and the light that guides ships across the void that is not quite a beacon. We have walked through the catastrophe that follows the Emperor's death, minute by minute and faction by faction, and we have examined the theories that suggest this catastrophe might not be the end of the story. Let us now try to hold all of these things together and ask the hardest question. What does it all mean? The Warhammer 40,000 setting is defined by its atmosphere of grinding, inevitable darkness. The phrase that encapsulates it, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war," is not an accident. It is a philosophical statement about the nature of the setting. This is not a universe trending toward improvement. The Imperium is not getting better. The threats are not diminishing. The sacrifices that sustain the civilization are not becoming less horrific. The Emperor's situation has not improved in 10,000 years. It has gotten worse, slowly and steadily, in a way that cannot be reversed and can only barely be managed. The death of the Emperor takes this atmosphere and intensifies it beyond anything the current setting has managed. It is the apocalyptic conclusion that the setting has been building toward for decades. And the question the setting has always refused to fully answer is whether this conclusion is the end or the beginning of something else. If you believe the pure catastrophe scenario, the Emperor's death marks the final collapse of humanity's organized resistance to the forces that want to consume or destroy or enslave it. The Imperium fragments, the warp surges, the Chaos Gods feast on the psychic death scream of the greatest human psyker in history and emerge stronger than they have been since the birth of Slaanesh. The Tyranids advance unopposed through a galaxy whose defenders can no longer coordinate. The Necrons emerge from their tombs to find the dominant civilization of the current age has essentially destroyed itself, and in 1,000 years, or 10,000 years, or 100,000 years, the galaxy is a very different place. Darker and stranger and older, populated by scattered remnants of what used to be great civilizations, and perhaps by things that have emerged from the chaos that no one would recognize as connected to any of the old players. If you believe the Star Child scenario, The Emperor's death is not an ending, but a metamorphosis. Something emerges from the warp that is neither the tired, deteriorating consciousness, barely sustaining itself on the throne, nor simply a ghost of what the Emperor was. Something that has 10,000 years of accumulated human faith behind it, and the architecture of a consciousness that has been planning this transformation for longer than recorded history. Something that might, for the first time in the setting's history, actually be capable of meeting the Chaos Gods at their own level. Not of defeating them permanently, because the setting has established clearly that the Chaos Gods cannot be permanently destroyed, but of changing the balance in a way that gives humanity, and perhaps other species, a genuine chance. The grimdark atmosphere of the setting would survive either ending, but it would survive differently. A pure catastrophe is the darkness of complete loss. A Starchild emergence is the darkness of transformation, of the terrible cost that change requires, of the recognition that what comes after might be genuinely different, but will not be without its own horrors. Warp entities do not make comfortable protectors, even friendly ones. A god of order born from human faith might be exactly as terrifying in its way as the chaos gods it opposes, simply oriented differently. There is also the possibility that the real answer is neither of these. That the Emperor's death triggers events that the setting's creators have not yet revealed, that the lore around this moment is still being actively developed, and that the actual resolution, when it comes, will draw on threads that have been laid quietly into the narrative for decades, but that have not yet been pulled tight. The Starchild theory is old lore being slowly reintroduced. The perpetual mechanics are relatively new. The hints dropped in the Siege of Terra series about the Dark King prophecy and the Emperor's willingness to become a warp entity when facing Horus are very recent. The full picture is not yet complete. What we can say is that the Emperor's death is not simply a disaster, it is a hinge point. The moment in which the galaxy's 10,000-year equilibrium breaks and something genuinely new becomes possible. Whether that new thing is better or worse than what existed before is, in the true spirit of the setting, entirely unclear. This is not a universe that makes promises. It simply presents possibilities and lets them play out in all their terrible, beautiful, grimdark detail. The man on the throne has been sitting there for 10,000 years. He has watched empires rise and fall, watched his sons turn against him, watched the civilization he built drift so far from his intentions that it would be nearly unrecognizable to the man he was at the beginning. He has sustained his people not through love in any simple sense, but through an act of will, so sustained and so immense that it has become something more than will, something closer to the bedrock of the universe itself. When he finally lets go, the galaxy will change. It will be catastrophic. It will be painful in ways that make the Horus heresy look like a skirmish. It will cost more than anything that has ever been paid before. And in the silence, after the shockwave passes, in whatever remains when the immediate devastation is done, something will begin that could not have begun while the dying man held his grip. Whether that something is the end of humanity's story or its most important chapter is the question the setting has been asking for as long as it has existed. And the answer, when it finally comes, will be entirely in keeping with everything that makes Warhammer 40,000 what it is. Brutal, strange, deeply human in its concerns, even when it speaks in the language of gods, and dark in ways that contain, somewhere in their depths, just enough light to make the darkness meaningful. The Emperor is dying, he has always been dying, and the galaxy holds its breath. The deeper horror, what the Dark King prophecy means. There is one more thread to pull on, one that the setting has introduced recently through the Siege of Terra novel series, and that casts everything we have discussed in a different and deeply disturbing light. It is the prophecy of the Dark King. During the Siege of Terra, in the final terrible days when the Chaos forces hammered against the Imperial Palace and the Emperor fought to maintain his defensive wards, something began to happen to the Emperor himself. Something that the Chaos Gods had apparently been planning for, or possibly that they had been dreading, depending on how you read the available sources. In his desperation, in the immense psychic effort of fighting the demonic tide alone while Horus ascended to godhood above, the Emperor began to draw on the warp in ways that had profound and terrible implications. The warp and reality began to interlock around Terra, in a pattern that the Eldar, watching from their craft worlds, recognized with absolute horror, because they had seen it once before, at the birth of Slaanesh. Terra looked, in those final days, the way the Eldar Empire had looked in the hours before its annihilation, like something was being born, not a chaos god of the conventional type, not something motivated by a single overwhelming emotion, but a fifth power, something that embodied destruction not as Khorne embodies violence, but as a fundamental principle, the Dark King, a font of oblivion, an entity representing the inevitable, merciless end of all things. And the entity that was beginning to emerge from this process was not Horus, it was the Emperor. He chose not to complete the transformation. Olanius Person, that ancient and extraordinary man who had stood at the Emperor's side across more of human history than almost anyone else, confronted the Emperor at the crucial moment and reminded him of his humanity, reminded him of what he was giving up, reminded him that becoming the Dark King would win the battle against Horus, but would consume humanity in the process, the way Slaanesh's birth consumed the Eldar. The Emperor chose to shed the power he had accumulated and face Horus without it, gambling everything on a battle he was likely to lose, rather than becoming something that would guarantee victory at the cost of everything the victory was supposed to protect. He lost the battle. He survived only by destroying Horus, and the cost was his body, his mobility, his ability to act directly in the physical world. But here is what the Dark King prophecy implies for the question of his death. The potential to become the Dark King did not disappear when the Emperor chose not to complete the transformation. It is still there, latent, waiting. The warp exists outside of time in important ways, and entities of the warp, once they begin to take form, have always existed in some sense. The Dark King was nearly born during the Siege of Terra. In the warp's timeless perspective, that near birth may mean the Dark King has always been there, coexisting with the Emperor's soul in the Immaterium, waiting for the moment when the choice can no longer be made. If the Emperor dies and his soul is released into the warp, what emerges might not be the benevolent star child of hopeful theory. It might be the Dark King, the entity that was almost born at the Siege of Terra, the fifth chaos power that represents absolute oblivion, not chaos in the sense of Khorne or Nurgle or Tzeentch or Slaanesh, not a patron of human emotion twisted to its extreme, but something that is the antithesis of all of them and of everything else. A power of unmaking, an entity before which even the chaos gods might hesitate, because it does not want to corrupt or consume or transform. It simply wants everything to stop. This is perhaps the most deeply grimdark possibility in a setting defined by grimdark possibilities. Not that the Emperor's death weakens humanity, not even that it empowers the existing chaos gods beyond humanity's ability to resist, but that the Emperor's death births something new that is, in the most fundamental sense, the enemy of everything that exists. The Eldar lost their civilization, giving birth to Slaanesh. Humanity might lose the galaxy, giving birth to the Dark King. The images that haunt the Library of Leng and the prophetic visions of the most gifted Farseer councils show the Dark King immolated on a throne of gold. This image has been present in the lore before the full implications of the Dark King prophecy were spelled out, and it is an image that can be read multiple ways. Is the throne of gold the Golden Throne? Is the immolation the moment of the Emperor's physical death? Is the Dark King, in this reading, already present in the figure on the throne, the terrible potential that has been sitting in the most sacred room in the Imperium for 10,000 years, contained by the Emperor's own choice, and by the machinery that keeps him exactly at the boundary between life and death? And if so, what happens to that containment when the machinery fails? We do not know. The setting has not answered this question, and it may be that the setting's creators are still deciding what the answer should be. But the Dark King prophecy changes the nature of the question fundamentally. It suggests that the Emperor's death is not just a catastrophe for humanity, or an opportunity for the Chaos Gods, or the precondition for a benevolent rebirth. It suggests that the Emperor has been, all along, a kind of sealed vessel, a container for something that could not be allowed to emerge. And the Golden Throne, in this reading, is not a life support system, or even primarily an anchor for the Astronomicon. It is a cage. one that was built with the full knowledge that what it contained was both the most important thing in the galaxy and the most dangerous. The Emperor chose not to become the Dark King because he valued humanity more than he valued victory. He made that choice once at the Siege of Terra, at the cost of everything. Whether the choice can be made again, whether the entity on the throne retains enough of what the Emperor was to make the same decision a second time, whether the warp allows for choices to be made twice at the same scale, these are questions that the lore leaves open. They are perhaps the most important questions in the setting, because the answer determines not just what happens when the Emperor dies, but what the Emperor actually is. Whether he is a man who became something more and chose to remain, at the core, himself, or whether he is something that was always more than man, wearing the identity of the Emperor as a kind of ethical anchor, and whether that anchor holds when the chain finally breaks. What remains when the Emperor is gone? Pull back from the details. Pull back from the theories and the factions and the cascade of disasters and the theological debates about what kind of entity might emerge from the warp after the greatest human psyker in history finally exhales for the last time. Pull back and look at the shape of the question itself. The Imperium of Man is an argument. It argues, through every practice and institution and text, that humanity can survive in the 41st millennium, that the cost of survival, as obscene as it is, as morally indefensible as many of its specific practices would be in any civilization we would recognize, is worth paying because the alternative is extinction. The daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers to sustain the Astronomicon is horrific. The Inquisition's methods are horrific. The crushing weight of religious authority that has replaced rational inquiry is horrific. But the argument, as the Imperium would make it, is that these horrors are chosen horrors, chosen to prevent worse things, chosen by a civilization that looked at the alternatives and decided that survival, even at this cost, was preferable to what the Tyranids or the Chaos Gods or the Necrons would offer instead. The Emperor on the throne is the physical expression of this argument. He embodies the idea that you can choose to endure suffering if the suffering serves a purpose beyond itself. He sits in a state that is worse than death, that has been worse than death for longer than most civilizations last, because his continued presence prevents something more terrible. He is a moral example in the most extreme possible form. The willingness to bear the unbearable, because the alternative is unacceptable. When he dies, this argument dies with him. Not because the argument was wrong, necessarily, but because the thing that made the argument livable, that gave it meaning and weight, the presence of the being who made the original choice, is gone. What remains is the institutional residue of that argument, the practices and the texts and the institutions, all of which continue to claim the Emperor's authority for themselves, but none of which actually have it. The Imperium without the Emperor is not just a government without a head. It is a philosophy without its philosopher, a faith without its God, or perhaps, more precisely, a faith whose God has finally gone wherever gods go. What replaces it, in the various scenarios we have examined, says something interesting about the nature of the setting. The Chaos Gods offer the replacement of meaning with sensation. The Tyranids offer the replacement of civilization with consumption. The Necrons offer the replacement of organic chaos with crystalline order, cold and silent and eternal. The Tau offer, in their corner of the galaxy, the replacement of human-centric survival with something genuinely multi-species, the greater good as an actual working philosophy, rather than the propaganda of a declining empire. And the Star Child, if it emerges, offers something stranger still, the replacement of a dying god with a reborn one. Not a restoration, not a return to what was, but something that carries what mattered from what was and builds something new from it. Something that might be genuinely different from what the Imperium was, might be better in some ways and worse in others, might offer humanity a path that the current arrangement cannot provide, but that would require everything the current arrangement depends on to burn first before the new thing could begin. This is the nature of apocalypse in its truest sense. Not simply the end, but the revelation that accompanies the end. The tearing away of what was to reveal what is underneath. The destruction of the comfortable, familiar to make way for the genuinely new. In that sense, the Emperor's death is not the tragedy of losing something good. It is the resolution of something that was always already broken, already in the process of falling apart, simply taking its time about it. The golden armor of the Imperium has been rusting from the inside for 10,000 years. When it finally collapses, what stands in the rubble might not be golden, but it might, just barely, have the possibility of being something more honest about what it actually is. Or it might be the Dark King, and everything ends. Both of these possibilities are, in their different ways, entirely in keeping with the setting. That is perhaps the most clarifying thing about this whole question. The Emperor's death is not a problem that has a good answer. It is a problem that has answers. Some of them terrible, some of them strange. Some of them so far beyond the framework of good and terrible that they require entirely new categories to understand. The setting does not promise resolution. It promises consequence. It promises that what has been set in motion will continue to move, and that the movement will be felt. The man on the throne has been dying for 10,000 years. He is still, in some sense, choosing to die rather than choosing to be something else. When the choice finally leaves him, when the machine gives its last groan, and the psychic shields drop, and the warp rushes in to fill the space where an emperor used to be, the galaxy will be different in every way that matters. It will not be better. It will not be worse in any simple sense. It will be transformed, the way everything is transformed when the thing that has been holding it in place is finally removed. And transformation is both loss and possibility simultaneously, and the line between them is not always clear when you are standing in the wreckage. The Emperor is dying, the throne is failing, the galaxy is waiting, and somewhere in the immaterium, shaped by 10,000 years of prayer and sacrifice and desperate hope, something is almost ready. Whether it is the light at the end of humanity's long dark, or the darkness itself wearing light's face, is, in the end, a question that even the setting does not fully answer. And maybe that is as it should be. Because in a universe where there is only war, the most important questions are the ones that do not have simple endings. What the Emperor's death means for faith itself. There is a dimension to the Emperor's death that goes beyond the political and the military and the cosmological, and it might be the most practically important one for the billions of ordinary human beings who do not command chapters of Space Marines, or sit on the high throne, or possess the kind of psychic sensitivity that allows them to feel changes. In the warp, that dimension is faith. The imperial cult is not simply a political tool, though it has been wielded as one for 10,000 years. For the ordinary human being, on an ordinary world, in the imperium of man, faith in the Emperor is the organizing principle of existence. It is the answer to why you wake up and go to work, and pay your tithes, and submit to conscription when the regiment needs filling. It is the answer to why suffering is bearable, because suffering for the Emperor has meaning in a universe that would otherwise offer none. It is the answer to death itself, because dying in the Emperor's name is not merely dying, it is completion. It is the fulfillment of the purpose for which you were born. Remove the Emperor, and you do not simply remove a political authority. You remove the meaning structure of trillions of lives simultaneously. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated or overestimated. Human beings can endure extraordinary suffering when they believe it serves a purpose. They break with much smaller suffering when they cannot find a reason for it. An imperium without the Emperor is not just an institution without a leader. It is a civilization without a reason. The response to this crisis of meaning would not be uniform, and it would not all be healthy. Some populations would double down on their faith, would insist with desperate intensity that the Emperor is not dead, that what seems like his absence is, in fact, a trial, that the faithful are being tested, and that their persistence in the face of the evidence of his death is itself the most important act of devotion they can perform. History is full of religious movements that became more fervent in the wake of their central figure's death, not less. The martyrdom of a god does not necessarily end the religion that worshipped that god. It can transform it into something more intense and more insular and more capable of sustaining its adherents through hardship than the original institution ever was. Other populations would fracture, with different factions claiming to represent the authentic interpretation of what the Emperor's death means, and each of those factions finding reasons why the other interpretations are heretical, and the heretics must be dealt with accordingly. The Imperium has always had this tendency. The wars of faith in its history were not caused by external pressure, but by internal disagreement about what the emperor wanted and how his will should be carried out. In the aftermath of his death, with no central authority to arbitrate these disputes, the internal theological wars could be catastrophic. The living saints, those individuals on whom the emperor's blessing has manifested in the most visible and undeniable ways, would become the focal points around which surviving imperial communities would organize themselves. Celestine, the living saint, who has died and returned multiple times, and whose miracles are too well documented to be dismissed by even the most cynical observers, would become enormously important in whatever follows the collapse. Whether she would be adequate to the role that would be thrust upon her, whether any individual could be, is a genuine question. The weight of being the visible sign of divine favor in a galaxy where the divine has just apparently abandoned its people is not a small thing to carry. The question of miracles is central to this. If the emperor is dead in the simple sense, if there is no longer any being in the warp or elsewhere that corresponds to the emperor and can respond to prayer, then the miracles that have defined the Adeptus Sororitas' military identity and that have given the entire imperial cult its most compelling evidence of divine presence would stop. The bolts that turn aside inexplicably, the dying warriors sustained for one more crucial act by strength they should not have. The moments where an entire battle turns on an intervention that no military analysis can explain. If these things stop, the last experiential argument for the emperor's divinity evaporates, and the faith that sustained the Imperium becomes, in the most direct possible way, merely a belief rather than something supported by ongoing evidence. But if they do not stop, the implications are profound. If living saints continue to manifest, if miracles continue to occur, if the Adepta Sororitas' battle sister, who prays in her last moment, continues to be answered with something that she experiences as the Emperor's presence, then either the faith itself has become self-sustaining in the warp, in a way that does not require the Emperor to be alive and consciously responding, or the Emperor is still present in the warp in some form, and is still capable of reaching into the physical world. Either of these conclusions changes the nature of the aftermath dramatically. The Chaos Gods would certainly prefer the first conclusion, and would work tirelessly to establish it in the minds of the faithful, because a faith that operates purely on the accumulated momentum of its own tradition is much more vulnerable to infiltration and subversion than a faith backed by an active divine presence that can call out corruption when it encounters it. A God who is dead, and whose miracles are the echoes of what he was, rather than the actions of what he is, cannot warn his followers that their bishop has been whispering to Tzientch in his dreams. A God who is still present, however changed, still can. This is perhaps the most intimate level at which the Emperor's death would be felt, not the destruction of institutions, or the collapse of supply chains, or the military catastrophes of a galaxy suddenly undefended, but the moment in a quiet chapel on some world that will probably never make it into any history book, when a person kneels in the gray morning and prays with the sincere desperation of someone who has run out of all other options, and the question of whether anything is listening becomes not a theological abstraction, but the most pressing practical matter in their life. The Imperium of Man has always made that prayer meaningful. Whatever comes after must find a way to do the same, or it will not last long enough to become anything worth talking about. The successor states, what comes after collapse? Every great empire that has ever fallen has left successor states behind it. Not immediately. The immediate aftermath of collapse is almost always chaos. The specific kind of chaos that does not serve the Chaos Gods, but simply describes a condition in which no authority is adequate to the situation, and everyone with the means to do so is trying to establish themselves before someone else, establishes themselves first. But after the immediate chaos settles, after a generation or two, or three of brutal attrition, something always emerges, smaller than what fell, different in character, built from the pieces of the old system that were durable enough to survive the collapse and flexible enough to adapt to new circumstances. The realm of Ultramar is the most obvious candidate for the primary successor state to the Imperium. Guilliman built it to be self-sufficient, defensible, and administered according to principles that actually work rather than traditions that have been maintained long past the point of relevance. He has spent the years since his resurrection running the Indomitus Crusade, precisely to extend the network of defended systems and reliable governance that Ultramar represents. If Terra is gone, and the High Lords are gone, and the Astronomicon is dark, Guilliman's realm of Ultramar does not cease to function. It continues to govern itself. It continues to manufacture and recruit and train. And it has Guilliman himself, a being of extraordinary capability and unmatched strategic intelligence and direct genetic connection to the Emperor, to lead it. The realm of Ultramar, as an imperial successor state, would face enormous challenges. The most immediate is the same one that every potential successor state faces. The Astronomicon is gone, and long-range warp travel is no longer reliable. Ultramar cannot project power across the galaxy the way the Imperium did. It cannot maintain a network of 1,000,000 worlds because it cannot communicate with 1,000,000 worlds quickly enough to govern them. What Guilliman would be building is necessarily something smaller and more local. Perhaps a few dozen systems, perhaps a few hundred if the stellar geography allows for reliable short-hop travel between them. Not a galactic empire, a regional power. The Mars-centered Mechanicus would be another major successor state, different in character from the Ultramarian model because the Mechanicus is organized around very different principles. Where Guilliman would be trying to preserve something recognizable as the Imperium's governance structures, the Mechanicus would be trying to preserve the technological knowledge and manufacturing capacity that represents humanity's accumulated capability. These are related goals, but not the same goal, and the relationship between the two successor states, if both survive, would be complex and probably competitive. The Space Marine successor states, scattered across the galaxy, would each develop their own character in the absence of central authority. Some would be genuinely admirable, protected enclaves where the local chapter's values determine the nature of governance, some chapters being more enlightened in this than others. Some would be more problematic, chapters whose values include things that the Imperium's oversight had previously kept in check, now expressing those values without constraint. The variety of what the chapters become in the absence of central authority would be enormous, and the galaxy, a generation after the Emperor's death, would contain a collection of micropolities so diverse in their character and governance that trying to map them in any comprehensive way would be an impossible undertaking. The question of whether these successor states can cooperate, can find enough common ground to face the threats that the Emperor's death has made more dangerous rather than less, is perhaps the most important practical question of the aftermath. A collection of isolated polities, each fighting their own wars against chaos and the Tyranids and the Necrons and each other, is not going to produce a positive outcome for humanity as a species. The logic that the Emperor used when he originally united Terra, that fragmented humanity fighting individually is worse off than united humanity fighting together, does not stop being true just because the mechanism he used to enforce unity has collapsed. Who steps into the role of unifier? Guilliman is the obvious candidate, but he has already tried this and found the scale of the problem overwhelming, even with the Emperor technically still alive. Without the legitimizing presence of the Emperor, his authority is based on being the biggest, most capable military power in the vicinity, and being recognizably committed to outcomes that are better for humanity than the alternatives. This can work. Empires have been built on less, but it requires Guilliman to be present everywhere simultaneously, which he cannot be, and it requires the other successor states to accept his authority, which some of them will not. The alternative is that no one successfully unifies humanity's remnants in the immediate aftermath, and the galaxy settles into a dark period analogous to what happened when the Age of Strife collapsed humanity's previous stellar civilization. Individual worlds and systems survive or fall based entirely on local conditions. Knowledge is lost because the networks that allowed it to flow across the galaxy have been destroyed. Technology degrades because the supply chains that provided the parts for its maintenance no longer exist. The population declines as the worlds that could not be self-sufficient fail to feed themselves. This dark period, if it happens, would last until either a new unifying figure emerges or a new unifying threat forces the remnant powers to cooperate or be consumed. The Tyranids have historically been excellent at forcing cooperation between entities that would otherwise be fighting each other. Hive Fleet Behemoth turned the Imperium and the Eldar into temporary allies. A Tyranid incursion of sufficient scale in the aftermath of the Imperium's collapse might produce exactly the kind of alliance between human successor states and Eldar craft worlds, and possibly even certain Necron dynasties, that would be necessary to survive. Not a new Imperium, something messier and less formal, and perhaps, in some ways, more honest about what it actually is. The question of the Golden Throne's secrets. There is one more dimension to this question that has been gradually revealed through recent lore, and that changes the nature of the entire discussion in ways that have not yet been fully worked through. The Golden Throne has secrets. Not just the secret of its deterioration, though that is certainly among them, but secrets about its fundamental nature and purpose that suggest the device has always been doing something more than what the Mechanicus and the High Lords have understood it to be doing. The most significant of these secrets is the possibility that the Golden Throne is not primarily a life support device at all, that the life support function, the maintenance of the Emperor's biological existence, is secondary, that the primary function of the device is something different, the containment and amplification of a psychic process that the Emperor began at the Siege of Terra, and that has been continuing for 10,000 years without anyone fully understanding what it is. Consider the mathematics of the Emperor's situation. He is the most powerful human psyker who has ever existed. He is sustained by the daily sacrifice of up to 1,000 psykers. He channels the life force of up to 10,000 additional psykers through the Astronomican apparatus. Over 10,000 years, the sheer volume of psychic energy that has flowed through the Emperor and the throne apparatus is staggering. Some of it has gone into the Astronomican, some has been expended in maintaining the warp ward around the palace. But what about the rest? Where does the excess go? The throne is not simply consuming these souls and discarding the energy. Machines of this sophistication do not operate that way. Every element of the Golden Throne's function is deliberate, and the direction in which psychic energy flows is not accidental. The most plausible interpretation, which several inquisitorial theories have reached through different routes, is that the excess psychic energy has been building the Star Child. That the throne has been, among its other functions, serving as a psychic accumulator and refinery, taking the raw energy of sacrificed souls and transforming it into something structured and specific that accumulates in the warp in the form of the emerging Star Child entity. That every psyker who has died on the Soul Throne in 10,000 years has been not simply burned as fuel, but converted into building material. That the Emperor on the throne has been spending 10,000 years, not dying, but constructing. If this is true, it changes the moral calculus of the throne's daily sacrifice entirely. The death of 1,000 psykers every day is horrifying under any moral framework. But there is a difference between dying as simple fuel for a failing machine and dying as the raw material for the construction of a god capable of facing the chaos powers at their own level. Neither is comfortable. Neither resolves the ethical problem of using human beings this way, but one has a purpose that extends beyond the continuation of the current state of affairs, and the other does not. It also changes the interpretation of why the throne is failing. If the primary function of the throne is to build something in the warp rather than simply sustain the body, then the deterioration of the throne's mechanical components might be less about entropy and more about completion. The device might not be failing because it is old and poorly maintained. It might be completing its cycle, approaching the moment when the construction project has reached the point where it can sustain itself without the device's support, and the deterioration of the device is a consequence of that approach rather than a cause for alarm. This is the most optimistic possible interpretation of the throne's failing status, and it should be held as such, with appropriate skepticism. It is exactly the kind of interpretation that could lead an inquisitor to decide not to intervene in the throne's deterioration on the grounds that the deterioration is intended, which would be catastrophic if wrong. It is also exactly the kind of interpretation that Tzeentch would want spreading through the Inquisition's ranks, because it would produce the same outcome of non-intervention through hope rather than through despair. The Chaos Gods are not above arranging for accurate information to reach the wrong people at the wrong time for the right reasons. But if it is true, then the Emperor's death is not the end of his plan. It is the execution of it. The throne stops, the body dies, The daemonic tide pours through the breach, the talisman activates, and Terra burns. And in the burning, in the massive psychic event of that destruction, the last energy barrier between the Star Child and its full manifestation is released. And what walks out of the immaterium on the other side of the catastrophe is what the Emperor has been building for 10,000 years. Not the Emperor as he was, something new, something that carries his intentions and his understanding and his determination, but has become what he always knew he needed to become if humanity was going to have a chance at surviving the far future. A being of the warp that serves as the direct counterpart to the chaos powers. Not a god of a specific emotion, a god of humanity's capacity to endure, to persist, to refuse to be consumed by the forces that press against it from every direction. Whether that god would care about individual humans the way the Emperor once, in his mortal incarnations, cared about the people around him is genuinely unknown. A warp entity of that magnitude might relate to individual human beings the way a human being relates to individual cells in their body, aware of them in aggregate, dependent on them for continued existence, but unable to engage with them as individuals in any direct way. The miracles would continue, because the entity cares about the persistence of humanity as a collective. But the intimate, personal relationship between worshipper and divine figure that the imperial cult has always implied might not be possible at that scale. This is, in its way, the loneliest possible version of the Emperor's return. A god who is present and powerful and genuinely on humanity's side, but who is so far beyond individual human experience that the personal faith that sustained people through darkness has been replaced by something more like the relationship between a cell and the organism it is part of. Necessary, real, incapable of being reciprocal in any way a human would recognize as meaningful. The final reckoning. What makes a god? There is a question underneath all the others, the one that the setting has been circling for decades without quite landing on it directly. It is this: what makes a god in the Warhammer 40,000 universe? What is the difference between a very powerful warp entity and a god, and does that difference matter for how the galaxy's story resolves? The Chaos Gods are warp entities of immense power. They are worshipped. They respond to worship. They grant power and favor and mutation and doom to those who serve them. By every definition that a theologian would apply, they are gods. They are also, from another perspective, parasites, emotions made manifest. The inevitable consequence of sentient beings experiencing anything intensely enough for long enough. They did not choose to exist. They were made. They are not wise or purposeful in any comprehensive sense. Teach plans and schemes, but within the context of an existence that is itself the product of plans and schemes that no one chose. The Chaos Gods are what they are because mortal beings could not help being what mortal beings are. The Emperor, if he becomes a warp entity, would be something different. He would be a consciousness that chose to become what it became. Every shaman who contributed to his original formation made a choice. He himself made the choice not to become the Dark King, accepting unbearable consequences rather than gaining a victory at the wrong cost. He made the choice to take the throne, to endure 10,000 years of something worse than death, to sustain the civilization he built even as it drifted away from everything he intended it to be. A god built from deliberate choices, rather than from the unconsidered effluence of mortal emotion, is a genuinely different kind of entity. Whether that difference matters depends on what you think gods are for. If they are for power, then the Chaos Gods and the Emperor as warp entity are comparable, and the question is simply, which is more powerful in any given confrontation? If they are for wisdom, then the deliberateness of the Emperor's becoming suggests that what emerges from his death would have a quality that the Chaos Gods, for all their immensity, simply do not possess. The ability to want something other than what they are, the capacity for purpose that goes beyond the simple expression of the nature that generated them. The Eldar made Ynid to serve a specific purpose, to challenge Slaanesh and eventually to destroy the entity that has been consuming Eldar souls since the fall. Whether Ynid will succeed in this purpose is an open question, but the fact that the Eldar could deliberately create a god for a specific function suggests that such creation is possible and that the character of the created god can be oriented toward the desired function. If the Emperor has been building the Star Child for 10,000 years with equal deliberateness, then the Star Child's function, its fundamental character as a warp entity, would reflect that deliberateness. A god of human endurance, a god of the choice to persist against impossible odds, a god who is, in some sense, made from the aggregate of every prayer spoken in darkness, every soldier who held the line one more minute, every farmer who planted the field, knowing the harvest might go to war rather than to the table, every mother who raised children to serve in an institution that would use them up without gratitude. All of that poured into the warp over 10,000 years, shaped by the consciousness that knew what it was building, directed toward the specific purpose of opposing the forces that want to end humanity's story prematurely. That God would not be safe. It would not be gentle. It would not be the warm and approachable divine father that the imperial cult has always implied the Emperor to be. But it might be real in a way that the other gods in this universe, for all their power, are not. Real in the sense of being a conscious choice, rather than an inevitable consequence. Real in the sense of knowing what it is and why. In the grim darkness of the far future, that might be enough. The psychic shockwave and the awakening of mankind. One of the less discussed consequences of the Emperor's death is what happens to the millions of latent human psychers who have been shielded, however imperfectly, by the Emperor's ongoing psychic presence in the warp. The Imperium's black ships spend their existences crossing the galaxy, gathering psychically gifted individuals and bringing them to Terra for sanctioning. Sanctioning is a process that binds a psyker's connection to the warp within controlled parameters, makes them less dangerous to themselves and others, and theoretically puts them under the protection of the Emperor's psychic oversight. It is an imperfect system. Many psychers are consumed by the throne rather than sanctioned. Many worlds lack access to the black ships for decades between visits. And many latent psychers are never identified at all, their low-level gifts expressing themselves as lucky coincidences or inexplicable instincts, rather than as the dramatic manifestations that attract official attention. The Emperor's death releases these people simultaneously from the limited but real protection his presence has always provided, and into a warp that is suddenly more hostile and more actively predatory than it has been in living memory. A latent psyker who was previously just someone with good intuition might find, in the days following the Emperor's death, that their connection to the warp has been activated in ways they have no training to manage. The warp entities that were previously deterred by the ambient psychic pressure of the Emperor's presence would find these individuals suddenly much more accessible. Poltergeist events, daemonic possession, spontaneous pyrokinetic expressions in crowded places, all of these would surge in frequency across the human population of the galaxy in the immediate aftermath of the Emperor's death. This represents both a catastrophe and an opportunity of the most uncomfortable kind. The catastrophe is obvious. Unprepared psychers manifesting in uncontrolled ways in communities that have no mechanism to deal with them outside of the Inquisition, and the Inquisition is either destroyed, scattered, or too overwhelmed with the immediate military catastrophes to chase every village where the local wise woman has started setting fires with her mind. The opportunity, which the Chaos Gods would certainly recognize before most humans do, is that the psychic awakening that was already underway in the final years of the 41st millennium might accelerate dramatically, not in the controlled, productive direction the Emperor may have intended, but in the direction of raw, unfiltered manifestation that serves whoever is quickest to exploit it. The Chaos Gods have always been skilled at identifying and cultivating psychic talent in humans. A galaxy suddenly full of awakening, untrained, unprotected psychers is a galaxy full of potential cult leaders and potential sorcerers, and potential demonic hosts. From the Chaos Powers' perspective, the Emperor's death does not just remove their greatest enemy and open the warp breach beneath the palace. It opens 1,000 smaller breaches in the form of human minds that are suddenly accessible in ways they were not before. The counter to this, the thing that might prevent the Chaos Gods from simply harvesting this sudden abundance of psychic potential, is the possibility that some of these newly awakened individuals would instinctively orient themselves toward whatever remains of the Emperor's psychic presence, rather than toward the Chaos Gods, who are aggressively recruiting. Faith, even unstructured faith, has a psychic character in this universe. A person who has prayed sincerely to the Emperor their entire life, and who suddenly manifests psychic ability in the aftermath of his death, might find that their ability naturally expresses itself through the lens of their faith, producing the same miraculous phenomena that have always been associated with the Adepta Sororitas, even without any formal training. These individuals would become, in the absence of sanctioned psychers and the infrastructure of the Scholastica Psychana, the local spiritual authorities of their communities. Not trained psychers, not Inquisition-approved practitioners. Simply human beings whose psychic ability found a channel in their existing faith, and who now have a power that commands respect and attention from the people around them. Whether these individuals make good use of that power depends on everything that made them who they were before it manifested. Their values, their relationships with their communities, their understanding of what the Emperor represents and what they believe he would want from them. In the best cases, they would become exactly what the failing Imperium needs: local anchors of stability, capable of identifying and resisting demonic influence, capable of providing the community with a continuing sense of divine presence and protection, even after the institutional structure that previously provided that sense has collapsed. In the worst cases, they would become exactly what the Chaos Gods want: corrupted, confused, and enormously powerful vectors for the spread of warp taint in communities that have no defense against them. The Emperor's death does not end humanity's psychic evolution. It may accelerate it, in a direction and at a pace that no one planned for and no one is prepared to manage. Whether that acceleration leads towards something the Emperor would recognize as what he was building toward, or whether it simply provides the Chaos Gods with a more efficient mechanism for consuming human souls, is perhaps the question whose answer is most uncertain and most consequential. The silence before the dawn. There is one last thing to sit with before we close this out. It is not a theory or a lore point or a faction analysis. It is something simpler and in some ways more important. The Emperor has been alone for 10,000 years. Not lonely, perhaps, in the sense that the term applies to beings who have the capacity for human connection and are denied it. His consciousness, whatever it is now, may have moved beyond loneliness, the way that the deep ocean moves beyond the experience of individual waves, but isolated, cut off from the direct engagement with the world that he spent tens of thousands of mortal years accumulating, unable to speak freely except through fragmented psychic transmissions that may or may not reach anyone capable of understanding them, unable to act directly except through the vast, slow, indirect mechanisms of faith and the Astronomicon and the psychic influence that seeps from him into the lives of the humans who pray in his name, without knowing whether anything hears them. He has watched his Imperium drift away from everything he intended it to be. He has watched the religion he never wanted become the organizing principle of human civilization. He has watched the secular rationalism he tried to establish be replaced by superstition and dogma, so thorough that the original intellectual tradition of his Great Crusade survives only in the most restricted and secretive archives. He has watched his sons, those extraordinary beings he made to be the best expression of human potential, scattered and corrupted and killed, the loyal ones, maintaining civilizations he can no longer directly communicate with, and the traitors, pursuing agendas that represent everything he tried to prevent. He has done this for 10,000 years. Whatever the Emperor has become in that time, it is reasonable to assume that the experience has changed him, not simply weakened him or preserved him in amber, but changed him in the way that 10,000 years of the most extreme isolation imaginable would change any consciousness capable of experience and reflection. The being that existed at the siege of Terra, the general and the politician, and the father and the god in progress, would not be identical to whatever inhabits the throne now. It would carry all of that history, but it would have metabolized it in ways that cannot be predicted from the outside. If the Emperor is conscious enough to have thoughts about his situation, and the evidence suggests he is at least periodically, those thoughts are his alone. No confessor, no friend, no family member, no advisor can reach him in any way that allows for genuine dialogue. He is the most powerful being in the Imperium of man, and the most alone. He speaks in visions, and in the feeling that soldiers get on the battlefield when the line somehow holds against impossible odds, and in the miracle that should not have been possible, but was anyway. He speaks in the only languages available to a consciousness that cannot use words. When he dies, this isolation ends. Whatever emerges from his death into the warp, whether the Star Child or something else, whether the Dark King or something that confounds all the prophecies by being genuinely unexpected, it will have that 10,000 years behind it. The weight of all those years of watching and waiting and sustaining and fighting and losing things that could not be replaced and refusing to let go of things that could not be saved. That weight will be part of what it is. And perhaps that is the most important thing about the Emperor's death. Not the catastrophe it triggers, or the cosmic entities it might produce, or the factions it leaves to fight over the ruins, but the ending of the silence, the release of a consciousness that has been held in an impossible state for longer than most civilizations last, finally allowed to be what it is, rather than what the machine requires it to be. Whether that release is beautiful or terrible, or something that has no word yet because it has never happened before, it ends something that has never been right. The Emperor's situation has never been right. The throne is not salvation, it is endurance. The difference matters, and the ending of endurance, whatever it looks like, is not simply a catastrophe. It is also, in some fundamental sense, a mercy. The Emperor and humanity's actual future. It would be a mistake to leave this question only at the level of theology and faction politics and cosmological horror. Because underneath all of it, underneath the chaos gods and the Star Child theories and the failing throne and the fragmenting empire, the question of the Emperor's death is fundamentally about what happens to the ordinary human beings of the 41st millennium. The billions of people on a billion worlds who have never seen a space marine and never met an inquisitor and never been close enough to the warp to feel its pressure, who grow food and make things and raise children and try to live lives that have some meaning in a universe that seems to have very little interest in providing meaning on request. These people are the Imperium in the most literal sense, not the institutions, not the Space Marine chapters with their 1,000 years of history and their gene seed and their fortress monasteries, not the Mechanicus with their forge worlds and their incalculable technical knowledge, not the Custodians or the Inquisition or the High Lords. The Imperium of man is the man, the woman, the child who has been told since before they could fully understand the words that they live in an Imperium protected by a God Emperor who sits on a golden throne on a distant and holy world and who watches over them. When that child grows up and the throne stops and the God dies, the world they inhabit does not simply continue as before with a change in administration. The framework through which they understood their world, their place in it, and their obligations to the people around them has been destroyed. This is not merely a spiritual crisis in the abstract sense. It is a practical crisis. Communities organize around shared beliefs. Laws derive their authority from shared values. The willingness to sacrifice for others, to contribute to communal defense and communal welfare, to pay tithes that go to a central authority that you trust, to use them appropriately, all of these depend on a shared understanding of why they matter. The most dangerous thing that happens after the Emperor's death is not the daemonic incursions or the collapse of the Astronomicon or the fragmenting of the Space Marine chapters. It is the dissolution of the shared moral framework that allowed individual humans to live together in organized communities, rather than in the predatory competition for resources that emerges whenever the institutions that shape behavior collapse. History is full of examples of what happens when the organizing institutions of a civilization fail suddenly. The resulting period is not simply one of political uncertainty, it is one of moral uncertainty, where the things that were previously understood as wrong, as prohibited, as harmful to the community, become negotiable because the authority that enforced the prohibition is gone. In the short term, this produces the kind of chaos that the setting's villains thrive on. Populations without moral consensus are easy to manipulate. A community where people have stopped believing in anything larger than their immediate survival is a community that will follow whoever offers the most compelling story about why their suffering serves a purpose. Chaos cult recruiters do not primarily appeal to greed or fear, though both are useful. They appeal to meaning. They offer a framework that makes the difficulty of existence make sense, that gives suffering a purpose, and provides community and belonging and a reason to act in the world. These things are what the Imperial cult provides under normal circumstances. Without the Imperial cult, without the Emperor to stand at the center of it, the chaos cults become the most capable providers of meaning available. The spread of chaos, corruption, through the remnant human populations in the aftermath of the Emperor's death would be slower than the military and cosmological catastrophes, but ultimately more thorough. A world can survive a demonic incursion if the defenders are capable enough. It cannot survive a population that no longer has any coherent reason to defend itself. The ruinous powers are patient. They do not need to win the military campaign. They need to win the cultural one. The one in which the story humanity tells itself about who they are and why they matter is replaced by a different story that serves a different master. The worlds that would resist this are the ones with strong local traditions that can operate independently of the central imperial framework. Feudal worlds, where loyalty to the local lord is more visceral and more immediate than loyalty to a distant emperor, have a paradoxical advantage. Their loyalty has always been local, and local authority survives the collapse of the central one better than institutions that derive their legitimacy entirely from the center. Some death worlds, those brutally hostile environments where human communities have always defined themselves primarily in opposition to the environment that wants to kill them, would find that their existing cultural framework, we survive together or we die separately, is remarkably resilient. The shared enemy does not stop being an enemy just because the Imperium stopped existing. The Hive worlds are the most complicated case. Billions of people crammed into structures that cannot produce their own food or maintain their own atmosphere, dependent on a supply chain that has now collapsed, would face an immediate material crisis that would make philosophical questions about the meaning of life temporarily irrelevant. When you are starving, the loss of metaphysical framework is a secondary concern. When you have eaten and are trying to figure out what to do next, it becomes primary again. The hive worlds that survive the immediate material crisis, those with sufficient local agricultural capacity or successful enough looting of their own stored reserves, would find themselves with billions of people who have survived something terrible and are now asking what to do with the survival. The answers they find, the leaders who emerge to provide those answers, and the institutions that crystallize around those leaders are what the galaxy's future is made of, not the cosmic battles between gods and chaos powers, as dramatic as those are, not the decisions of primarchs and inquisitors and chapter masters. The galaxy's future is made by a billion small decisions on a billion worlds, by people who have never had and will never have any direct engagement with the beings who have shaped the setting's grand narrative. This is, perhaps, the most hopeful and the most despairing aspect of the Emperor's death simultaneously. Hopeful because it places the outcome in the hands of ordinary people, because it means that the galaxy's future is not determined solely by the beings of immense power who have largely failed to make it better. Despairing because ordinary people, without the structures that allow them to act in coordination, without the shared beliefs that make sacrifice for others make sense, without the practical resources that the Imperium's supply chains once provided, are enormously vulnerable to the forces that want to consume or enslave them. The Emperor, if he understood this, and everything in the lore suggests he understood it better than anyone else who has ever existed, might have been preparing for it. The psychic awakening, the Primaris Marines, those more capable soldiers who can form the backbone of local defense without requiring the full machinery of the Imperium to sustain them. The subtle influences that the Emperor has been able to exercise through his fragmentary consciousness in the warp, shaping events in small ways that are difficult to trace, but that add up over centuries to something that looks like a plan. All of these might be oriented not just toward surviving the immediate catastrophe of his death, but toward providing the scattered communities of humanity with the building blocks of something new. Not the Imperium reborn. Something different. Something that keeps what was worth keeping, the capacity for coordination and mutual defense, and the preservation of knowledge across generations, without the parts that have been corrupt and dysfunctional for most of its existence. This is the most optimistic possible reading of the situation, and it requires a level of trust in the Emperor's foresight that the lore does not entirely justify. But it is not impossible. And in the grim darkness of the far future, not impossible is sometimes the best available description of hope. The ordinary human beings of the 41st millennium deserve something better than what they have. The question of whether the Emperor's death is the thing that finally provides it, or the thing that extinguishes their last chance of it, is the question that makes this topic matter. Not as a game mechanic or a fictional exercise, but as a genuine inquiry into what it means for any civilization to depend on any single point of failure, and what happens when that failure finally arrives. The answer is not comfortable. But then, nothing in this setting is supposed to be comfortable. It is supposed to be true, in the way that dark things can be true, and the truth of it is what gives it weight. If you made it all the way here, thank you, genuinely. This is the kind of lore that rewards the patient, the ones who want the full picture rather than the summary, the ones who feel the weight of 10,000 years of slow tragedy and still want to understand it better. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on which scenario you find most compelling. The Star Child, the Dark King, the perpetual reforming, the simple, final, permanent death, or something else entirely, something the setting has not yet fully articulated. There is no wrong answer, and this is the kind of question that gets more interesting the more perspectives you bring to it. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is really the time to change that. There is a lot more of this coming. The 41st millennium has depths that keep revealing new things the longer you look, and we are going to keep looking. Take care of yourselves out there. The Emperor protects, or he used to, or he will again, in whatever form that protection takes when the gold finally fades and something new begins. That is the thing about gods in this universe. You never quite know which tense applies.